I think they were more involved in it than just Oswald.
For years, many of
He was
former President John
working
F.
for
Kennedy's
CIA.
accomplishments have been overshadowed by facts and theories revolving around his untimely death. If you were to mention President Kennedy to someone, the first thing they would probably think of would be his assassination. But many forget the huge legacy Kennedy left behind for America, even though he was only president for less than a single term. He founded new groups who still make a difference throughout the world and made decisions that influence the lives of Americans to this day.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
Kennedy was inaugurated into the White House on January 20th, 1961. Just by being elected, Kennedy already broke some barriers of religious discrimination in politics. He was the first Catholic president ever elected. All others had been Protestant Christians. The words of his inaugural speech already gave the listener an idea of what Kennedy had in mind for America.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
I have today signed an executive order providing for the establishment of a Peace Corps.
One of Kennedy's first actions as president was the executive order to organize the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps were, and still are, meant to serve in nations around the globe, providing care for those in need, usually in impoverished regions where hunger and disease are major issues.
The Peace Corps gives us a chance to show a side of our country which is too often submerged, our desire to live in peace.
Although it was never outrightly stated by the president, the Peace Corps were organized with the intention of making the U.S. look both powerful and merciful during the Cold War.
In a very real sense, they are serving a larger cause, the cause of freedom and the cause of a peaceful world.
Also in 1961, Kennedy made the Green Beret the official headwear of the Special Forces Division of the U.S. military, resulting in them being referred to as the Green Berets ever since. Kennedy had a special connection with the Green Berets, even lasting after his assassination, when his wife requested to have them stand guard over his casket in the White House the night of his death. Although a great many of Kennedy's accomplishments during his presidency were and still are positive influences on the people of America, there's one instance in the beginning of his time in office that most do not forget. On April 17, 1961, a CIA plot to overthrow communist dictator of Cuba Fidel Castro failed when Cuban rebels trained by U.S. troops were massacred and held hostage by Cuban forces who knew the rebellion was coming. Kennedy took full responsibility for the failure, which came to be known as the Bay of Pigs disaster, named after where the catastrophe took place. Another contribution of Kennedy's administration was that he escalated the Vietnam War by sending more troops overseas. This, as well as the failed attempt to overthrow Castro in Cuba, was an attempt to stop the spread of communism during the Cold War. In the years after Kennedy's death, involvement increased even more until the U.S. eventually pulled out under President Nixon. In 1957, America's main opponent in the Cold War, the Soviet Union, launched Sputnik, the first satellite. Then in the same month of the Bay of Pigs disaster, they put the first humans in space. These factors caused President Kennedy to believe the U.S. had to catch up. As a result, NASA was formed.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Although Kennedy's dream of putting a man on the moon was fulfilled after his death, he was correct in predicting that the U.S. would be the first to put a man on the moon,
Before this decade is out,
seeing as Apollo 11 reached the moon in July of 1969. Kennedy was also among the first presidents to get directly involved in civil rights. In an interview conducted via telephone with distinguished Professor Alan Lichtman of American University, he stated that one of Kennedy's greatest examples of leadership was in becoming one of the first presidents
to morally denounce segregation of the races and drafting the first draft of what would ultimately become, after his death, of course, the Rights Act of 1964.
In addition to this, Kennedy was forced to use the National Guard to ensure African American student James Meredith entrance into the University of Mississippi after meeting extremely harsh resistance by racist white Southerners. There are still 2 more achievements of Kennedy's legacy that have left an astoundingly large influence over not only America, but also the entire world. Professor Lichtman claimed that
Kennedy started his presidency as a determined Cold Warrior, saying we'll pay any price, bear any burden.
this is especially true in his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
The U.S. obtained this knowledge through aerial surveillance photographs of Soviet missiles being installed in Cuba, less than 2 years after the Bay of Pigs disaster. In response to this threat, Kennedy ordered a blockade around the island to prevent the Soviets from bringing more missiles. This action led to 13 days of tension that brought the world the closest it has ever come to a full-scale nuclear war. But Kennedy negotiated with the Soviets, and the missiles in Cuba were removed without any damage being done to either country.
After the Cuban Missile Crisis, he completely turned around and decided to dedicate himself to toning down tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and working for peace.
Before the dark powers of destruction, unleashed by science, engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction.
Although nuclear war may have been averted with the negotiations between the US and the Soviets, the danger of nuclear holocaust was still an imminent possibility. Since nuclear weapons had been used to end World War II, the US and Soviet Union had been testing even stronger bombs in their own backyards. Despite them being just tests, they still posed a threat around the world due to the toxic waste produced. Witnesses of the test had high risks of being contaminated by deadly amounts of radiation, and exposed water could transfer this deadly contamination into the water cycle.
And that, of course, led directly to the most important treaty in the history of the world, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty.
If this treaty fails, it will not be our doing. And even if it fails, we shall not regret that we have made this clear and honorable national commitment to the cause of man's survival.
Kennedy, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain signed the treaty on August 5, 1963, to prevent these weapons from being tested in Earth's atmosphere. When asked if there is anyone alive today who has left behind a legacy comparable to Kennedy's, Professor Lichtman's reply was this:
Probably not to this point.
Unfortunately, Kennedy is remembered by most not for what he did for us, but for how he died. Time is not spent appreciating what he did, but is instead spent trying to prove or disprove conspiracy theories surrounding his death. But there are those who do remember what he did, and what he has left for us. The Peace Corps are still working throughout the world to promote peace. The Green Berets are still a functioning unit today, and are currently in Afghanistan fighting the war on terror. NASA is still researching the far reaches of space. Racism is no longer as much of an issue as it once was, and there have been no tests of nuclear weapons in Earth's atmosphere since the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed.
With history the final judge of our deeds,
It is for the American citizen to decide for themselves how much more Kennedy may have done if he had been able to finish his term, or if he had even gotten re-elected.
here on earth, God's work must truly be our own.